Thank you all for joining us for a discussion on ethics in sports. As we heard from Bob, biotechnical advances in the market are making the ethical landscape of athletics really complex these days. For example, there's been a lot of coverage in the news lately about genetic doping, which has been dubbed as the new best practice in cheating. Genetic doping, for those of you who don't know, is a laboratory process where scientists are able to inject synthetic genes into the system, into the body, to enhance performance. And so as we think about this, injecting synthetic genes into the body to enhance performance, such as building muscle, we have lots of evidence of potential cheating. And unlike chemical doping, genetic doping is difficult, very difficult, nearly impossible to detect. So we have some real concerns here. Shannon, during your talk, you talked about the influence of your network, your social network, your parents, your family structure, who really helped you navigate the ethical pitfalls that existed on your way to becoming an Olympic athlete and even after you became an Olympic athlete. Now as new challenges exist, ethical challenges and dilemmas that exist in sports are facing these new younger athletes, such as genetic doping. What advice do you have for how they can prepare themselves to be able to navigate these ethical pathways in the way that you did and be able to be successful in doing it?
First of all, I'm so glad that I'm not competing now. I don't have to deal with some of these really intense issues. Others maybe, but not these. I think at the end of the day, your ethics are your ethics. The ethics of doing what's right doesn't change, even though the questions might get more difficult, the challenges might get greater. What's right is what's right, and I think that goes back to setting the rules. You know, if we have rules for fair play, then my coach always said, she had this great line. She said, "Look, if you know the rules of the game, go play the game. Yes. Know the rules, I'll play the game." So I think if everyone knows the rules and everyone's playing by the rules, then we're on a good path. So there's going to have to be some rules made with regard to this, and I think that's where a lot of questions come in. But with regard to athletes, I think certainly staying true to your core values and surrounding yourself with advocates and people that can help you stay true to those core values is a really good start.
That's great, thank you. So Bob, for sports industry professionals who have the dilemma of having to keep pace of what's happening in the industry today, but also be able to predict what's coming around the corner in the future and be prepared for that, how do medical professionals, medical researchers as an example, prepare for a topic like genetic doping and stay ahead of that topic to be able to protect athletes, as Shannon mentioned, and to be able to influence the field in terms of policy and other topics?
So thank you. It's a great question. The problem is that our science is way ahead of our ability to understand the science or to understand what to do with the science. So people are inventing all kinds of stuff and discovering stuff in their labs all over the world at this point. It could be a lab in China, it could be a lab at a university, it could be a graduate student in his kitchen. We don't know. So there's lots of discoveries happening that are beyond our ability to think them through in terms of what the ethical implications, the social, the cultural, the educational, the sports implications are. And this is across the board a problem. I think one issue is that we need to increase education of these issues among providers, among doctors, among sports people, among lawyers, athletes, et cetera, because people still don't know much about them. The media often tries to keep up, but there's often sensational headlines that miss the more subtle points. So, for instance, there may be new discoveries that turns out may not work, or they may cause more danger and more harms than they help. So we know, for instance, there are gene therapy experiments in humans that have often killed patients. Right. We think we're going to be helping the patient, it does the reverse. So we don't always know. So we need to do more research. We need to educate people about these are new challenges. We need to look at them carefully. And I think the more people are aware of these issues through forums like this or others, I think the better off we'll all be.
Thank you. Carla, same question for you. Sports professionals in the industry have to stay current on the topics, the issues that are facing athletes and the business in general today, but they also have to be one step ahead in preparing for the future around issues surrounding genetic doping in particular. How do lawyers in the sports industry prepare for what's around the corner with issues like genetic doping for athletes, for competition, international competition, no less, an uneven playing field? What are lawyers thinking about now with respect to what's around the corner?
Well, I'm glad that Bob brought up the fact that often we're several steps behind technology in order to address it. And that's certainly the case with the law catching up to technology and innovations in ways that people may or may not be able to dope or cheat. So how can we keep abreast of things like that? Having a broad network of other professionals that you can talk to, having a broad array of information that you get from peer-reviewed journals, from reading cases, from reading arbitration decisions, for example, out of CAS. There are any number of ways that a lawyer could do that, and thank God with technology nowadays, it makes it easy to get micro news and as well to keep abreast in a broad array of areas.
Mm-hmm. So Carla, I'm going to come back to you on a different topic. I'm thinking about and reflecting on the forced patriotism that you mentioned during your talk. And last week I was watching television and I saw a TV commercial where there were 4 NFL players who had been known for their significant support of the national anthem protests. And those 4 athletes were doing a television spot in support of our U.S. veterans. They were advocating for how valuable our armed forces veterans are and for the freedoms that they allow us and how good this country is because of the service that they provide. When you look at the YouTube feed and the comments under this video, it's not what I expected. It is filled with a lot of anger and a lot of hate and a lot of criticism of hypocrisy. And so I guess my question to you is, what do our athletes, professional athletes and otherwise who are in the public spotlight, what do they owe their fans?
They owe their fans authenticity. If an athlete is exercising sincerely held beliefs, they should be respected by their fans, but they owe their fans authenticity. And there is this tension between sport as a product and sport as something that is an ideal. And it's a very difficult tension, and it's painful to see that even when somebody is exercising sincerely held beliefs or making an effort, an overture to show I'm not against the United States, I'm not against the values of our country, I'm not against our military, that it is received in such a way that is less than positive. The idea is to bridge the gap and continue dialogue, communication, and communion. Forced patriotism is not patriotism at all. It's actually antithetical to patriotism. I think the more that that message can get out and that the more we can educate fans as well and integrate things that are important to fans like respect for the military and showing devotion to the country and our values, I think perhaps some of that anger and resentment will ebb and at the same time allow the athletes to make their message.
If I can just comment, I think what is owed is mutual respect. I think that athletes should respect fans and fans should respect athletes, and we live in a diverse country with diverse views, and my sense is that many fans support athletes' protests and think that that is a good gesture that they're doing. And so there may be fans who are against it, fans who are for it. And I would hope that what athletes are doing by kneeling can help foster dialogue where we understand each other more and the fact that there are different opinions, particularly in the current environment.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. So Shannon, what do you think? As a former athlete, what do athletes owe their fans? Particularly, what is their ethical responsibility when we are debating and discussing these kinds of societal controversial issues? What do you think?
As an athlete, I I have a difficult time with the question. What do fans owe their athletes? What do athletes owe their fans? I guess I look at it as, if we don't have fans, then we don't get the opportunity to do what we love to do on the highest level. So I guess I look at it in a broader sense. I look at it as, how do we help athletes embrace that idea of being a role model? How do we help them do that? And how do we make it a positive thing for both sides? And I can remember coming back from Barcelona. I was 15 years old. I was a baby. And came back, saw my parents' living room floor. It was under 3 feet of fan mail. I'd never seen anything like this. I was just astonished. And my mother said, "You will answer all of those." And it was really her way of helping me understand that now this was a step farther. You know, I was going to be this role model, and I was this shy little girl that, I mean, I like to do gymnastics, but sitting up here in front of all of you talking would have just about killed me. I never imagined that I would be a role model for anyone. And as I worked through these different letters, I realized how many were from little girls, and it sank in. I still, to this day, I still meet people that say, "Oh my gosh, I wrote you when I was 12 years old," and you wrote back. And that, I mean, that makes me want to cry. It's such a great lesson, but I think it's important that we realize that we have this public opportunity. We have this platform that we can take advantage of. Athletes, especially, you know, some of the most prominent names, they have this opportunity to be in people's homes and lives, you know, almost every week, if not every day. And so we can take that opportunity to do really positive things. So how do we help younger athletes really embrace this idea? And I think it even goes a step further, the idea of role model, because it's not just about athletes. I know we're talking about that today, but I think we're all role models, because somebody's always watching. You know, when I think of the word role model, the words role model, I think of teachers and coaches and mentors. I think of parents. And if you guys are, any of you are parents out there watching, you know, what do our kids do? They do what we do, not necessarily what we tell them to do. We are being watched by everyone, and so I think it's a really important thing to remember that no one gets a pass. We are all that role model.
Yeah. So as a follow-up to that, Shannon, you competed in the 90s, right?
Yes.
This is
Way back in the
way back in the 90s. This is before social media.
Yes.
When we start to talk about the ethical responsibility of athletes, of fans, that interrelationship, how is it different now with social media? You don't have a basement full of letters.
No, I know, right? That's
to correspond. Now it's instantaneous. Now it is very judgmental. Now the responsibility is different for athletes, being on a different platform that is much more accessible to the fans. So when we're talking about ethics in sports and the responsibility of the athletes, how has it changed with social media?
Wow, there's been a really big learning curve. You know, it's funny, I still talk to, there's a certain age range out there that cannot comprehend that in 1996, after winning 2 gold medals, you couldn't tweet about it. I agree. There wasn't social media. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have internet. You know, our team went on tour after the Olympics, and we got AOL dial-up for the first time. And we were just rocking and rolling. But these days with social media, it's a landmine. It is, and we have to help these young athletes understand how to navigate that and really use that platform. And the U.S. Olympic Committee actually has a great program, and I've had the wonderful opportunity to be a part of it a couple of times. But they now have a program where every single athlete, it doesn't matter how many Olympics you've been to, doesn't matter what kind of professional athlete you are, or if this is your first Olympics, you go through this program before you go over to the Olympics, winter or summer. And they bring in former athletes to talk about every subject you can imagine, from the food to logistics to safety to social media and the landmines of social media. And they really have us discuss with these athletes the importance of legacy. What is your legacy? You're about to enter the world stage. The entire world will be watching you. So start thinking about your legacy now so that it continue. Think and understand that you have a platform. And you will have a platform, so how are you going to use that for good? Whether it's internationally, whether it's nationally, whether it's in your local community. What are you going to do with that? And so I think that's a really good start, to have these programs available so athletes begin to think of this on a larger scale and maybe aren't so quick to present a little bit too fast.
So earlier tonight, Shannon talked about her decision to turn pro at the age of 13. And I'd like to put that in the context of something that, Bob, you talked about relative to genetic testing and the predisposition for athletic ability. The sports market in China, in particular, is the largest in the world. They're targeting a 5 trillion yuan market by 2025. That's about $800 billion in the US. So it's a very, very large market. But they have little educational infrastructure to make sure that they realize the development of athletes in an honorable and in an advanced way, in reasonable way. So the question that I begin to think about is, I met with the Minister of Sport in China. His name is Yang Xuan. He and his delegation had a wonderful conversation with us from Columbia University and talked about how they are targeting children and trying to identify the best potential student athletes that they can have in their country. Again, the market is very large. The potential for these athletes to do well has a significant impact on the country. So as they think about their nationwide effort to recruit the predisposed athletes who are destined to be the best, and then on top of that, thinking about some of the things we've talked about today, genetic doping, where they can further enhance, those athletes' ability to perform at a very, very high level. Modifying these children is a very interesting and debatable topic. So Carla, I come back to you. Imagine that this child doping for genetic high performance on the athletic courts and playing fields and gyms was being done here in the United States.
Yes.
From your perspective as a legal expert, what are it's a softball question, I think. What are the legal considerations that we as a country, that we as legal professionals in the sports industry here in the United States would need to do to prepare for that eventual future?
The prospect of genetically modified children is so frightening to me on so many levels. They're difficult enough as it is without being modified. One can only imagine. It also sounds slightly Orwellian that we're even talking about this. But the legal challenges that I see are, for example, and I'm not aware of any legal precedent for permitting that here in the United States, or I could see there being numerous challenges to that. But the child is obviously not of the age of consent. One wonders about informed consent, about the procedure or the modification that the child underwent, the long-term health effects. Could we see situations where children are suing their doctors and or their parents for this modification? Perhaps, but this is a great example, I think, of what Bob was mentioning before, that technology sometimes eludes our grasp and we are struggling to keep up. And this situation in particular, I think, is worthy of very close watch.
Yeah. So Bob, I'll turn to you. These genetic modifications of children as athletes performing on the highest stage is happening in other countries. Are there forthcoming policies in the bioethics realm of research that are preparing the United States for the tests that are to come here? Will we be able to do that kind of genetic modification for our children here? When is that going to happen? And what are the ethical implications of us doing that?
Well, great questions and very big questions. I mean, they're big areas that they're asking about. What we can do now, for instance, is we can take an embryo, which would then divide into 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells, and become one of us in the womb. And we can now alter the genes inside it.
Yes.
These are new technologies. This became known about because the Chinese, a few years ago, began to publish papers about doing this. They said they were not implanting the embryos into the woman's womb, that they were just doing this in the petri dish. But of course, if you're doing it in the Petri dish, you could
Yes.
easily transplant it into the
Absolutely,
womb.
absolutely.
So as a result of that, about 2 years ago, there was an international summit held in Washington with researchers from China, the US, Great Britain, elsewhere.
Yeah.
And they said, okay, it's okay to do the research, but just don't put it into the womb. So that's where the current guidelines stand. Now, of course, you have rogue countries, you have rogue researchers, you have people in China doing various things, people elsewhere doing various things. So it's possible that, and some people think this is already going ahead. In this country, actually partly because of the religious right, there are a lot of prohibitions on stem cell research, for instance, in a lot of these areas. So I think that there's much more transparency and scrutiny in this country. A concern is what's happening elsewhere. I mean, I can't vouch for what Russia is going to be doing, or China, or other places. Of course, technology travels quickly, right? You
Right.
can put it in a suitcase and it goes through with you to wherever you want to travel. We're not set up to deal with this well. I should say, however, in terms of the ethical complexity, in some ways, we've been able to use these technologies, broadly speaking, to get rid of certain diseases. So there has been media attention about, quote, 3-parent babies, for instance, where there are people who are born with mutations in part of their cells, and we can now take, you know, an egg from one woman, an egg from a woman who has this problem, and take her nucleus, this DNA from one egg, and put in the other woman's egg, et cetera, and have children who no longer have this disease. So these technologies, on the one hand, could be used to get rid of diseases that'll kill kids. The problem is that the same technologies, potentially, or similar technologies, could be used to design various kids in ways that are more troubling.
Yeah, yeah. So Shannon, you won gold on the International Olympic stage. What is your reaction to using gene modification as a tactic for helping someone prepare to win gold in the future to beat the younger Shannon Miller, right? If someone had used gene modification and you hadn't won gold.
You know, I think, so I'm going to take a little bit of a turn on this. First of all, the conversation is fascinating and scary at the same time. Yeah. But I think I'm going to talk about part of the discussion that's not been had yet. So this reminds me of my days back in the gym. Growing up in the gym, we would have these girls come through that gym I trained at in Oklahoma, and they were far more talented than I could ever dream of being. And it was maddening because they could come in, they would learn these skills like it was nothing, and I'm standing there in awe, completely jealous. And I'm also standing on the other side of the gym falling 1,000 times before I get it right. And then we would go into competition. And when I noticed that some of these girls, if they made a mistake or they faltered, well, they couldn't always recover as much. They couldn't get their head back in the game. They hadn't really had to face adversity. So I think about that. I think about, yeah, I'm the right size for gymnastics. I am. But I was not very strong. I have these little toothpick little legs that I've always had. It doesn't matter how many squats I do. I could do them all day, every day. I'm never going to have the power of a Mary Lou Retton or Simone Biles. It's not going to happen. My coach, he talked about, I was never the strongest. I was never the most flexible. I had to do overtime on flexibility. I would sit in splits doing homework every night. I tried to sleep in the splits at one point. That didn't work out very well. But I was never the most flexible. I was never the most talented. I said, but Shannon worked harder than anyone else. I'd tell her to do 50 push-ups, she'd do 55. Run 10 laps around the gym, I'd run 12. He said for a while, I wasn't really sure if she was a hard worker, if she just couldn't count. But I think about that. I knew I had to work harder, and I think that's maybe some of the discussion that's being left out, because it's not just about genetics. Being a great athlete is more than that, and genetics cannot give you heart. It cannot give you that passion and that love of the sport. Genetics is not going to help you through the mental blocks and the fear and the pain and the nerves. Genetics can only take you so far, and then you've got to want it. And so I think it's important to have this discussion on so many levels, but I think part of that discussion is just the fact that genetics is part of the package, but there's so much more involved with being a great athlete.
Yeah, thank you. So we're at a university, and it makes sense for us to take a moment to talk about college athletics. A frequent question is whether college athletes should be paid for participating in college athletics. Last year, 24 universities each had revenue of over $100 million contributed by sports, directly from sports. And one estimate suggests that a Division I basketball player is worth $170,000 in revenue to that university. Each basketball player is worth that much. So these athletes are not paid, though, for their participation in sports. So my question to you, Carla, is multi-part. The first question is, should athletes be paid? And if so, should a school be allowed to require its athletes if they are not being compensated? So what are the considerations that a university should make, whether they should pay the athletes, and if they're not paying the athletes, what responsibility do they have to them for some other form of compensation?
So some people would argue that the athletes are compensated in the form of their scholarships and their meals, etc. But I think it's become an interesting question, and I mean, we've just had another sports scandal in college sports that's sort of shown a light on this issue. Some people would argue that the way to handle it is allow these athletes to, for example, accept endorsement deals and make money that way, or to permit them to have agents, and the agents could even be addressed and regulated by the NCAA. So should they be paid? I think that we've all grown past the idea that it's an amateurism model and that they are more than student athletes, and that they should be compensated, and that it's the right thing to do, because it's not fair that they're not sharing in these enormous revenues. And in fact, some leave school and they don't have enormous athletic careers, and they do need to be taken care of. I think there's also an interesting issue about the schools providing health care for the students even after they're done with their athletic career at the school. And that's something that the school, I believe, owes to the students, particularly what we know now about students developing CTE and head trauma. And I think that that's an important thing. But I think the model is giving way, and that we will see compensation happening. I don't know that the NCAA will go willingly with that, but I do think that its time has come.
Shannon, do you agree? Do you think that athletes should be paid and that we are going in that direction? And if so, what are the risks associated with evolving from the amateurism model?
So I finished my career before I was eligible to go to college. So it was kind of a backward thing for me. But I think this issue, I'm glad that it's coming to a point where people are looking at it and having the discussion head on. I think it's important. I think there could be arguments on both sides, but there's no arguing with the fact that these universities and colleges bring in huge amounts of revenue through college sports. And while yes, the athletes are compensated to some degree from their athletic scholarship, which can't be discounted. Certainly, if you're a parent, you don't discount that. But you can see that in many cases it's simply not in line with the amount of money that these colleges are bringing in. So, I think for me as an athlete, understanding and living through the blood, sweat, and tears, the sacrifice, the hard work, the commitment. And that commitment's not just for 4 years of college. It happened years and years in advance just to get to that point. I think I fall on the side of the athlete. And that's with the knowledge that most athletes, a handful are going to go on to a lucrative professional career, but most athletes, this is the culmination of their career. This is it.
So Bob, I'll lead off of what Shannon just said. With no guarantee of a payoff for a student athlete unless they succeed, what is the responsibility of the university to make sure that those athletes remain safe?
Well, I think there's a lot, and I think actually the recent evidence about traumatic brain injuries, I think, presents a big question for universities. If they have football players who are having traumatic brain injuries, and do athletes understand that? Is Are athletes feeling forced that if they really want to go to college, I guess I have to play football. That's the only way I'm going to go, and that means I'm going to have brain injuries, and they're not being given much of a choice. I think those are ethical questions, and I think universities really need to think it through. I would say one other thing, by the way, is that elsewhere in universities, there are scientists who come up with patents that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars for universities and don't get royalties per se. The money goes to the university. And so I think there are questions. If you decide we're going to pay athletes, there's a few questions. One is, do you just pay athletes if they win? Do you pay everyone $100,000 or $170,000? You just pay the few that are really going to win, and what does that mean for them? What does it mean for others? How would you do it? I think I would argue universities, to a certain degree, occupy or act as a sort of community in which some scientists go and earn a patent for $100 million the university gets, some don't, some athletes succeed, some don't. So it's, I think as long as the rules are clear from the get-go, we're offering you the scholarship. If someone feels that they're good enough in high school, they want to go play pro instead, and just make money, sort of what Shannon was saying. I mean, there are certain choices. You go to college right away, and there are advantages of that. There are disadvantages. You can maybe make more money outside. I think these are choices, and as long as people understand what they're getting into, to a certain degree, that's by one definition fair.
So as we get close to concluding this panel discussion, Carl, I'll turn back to you. Do you have any concluding remarks? We've talked today about ethics in sports. You've talked about the legal perspective for professionals. What else would you recommend to our audience here today we consider as a next question for the legal industry to be thinking about with respect to ethics in sports?
I think that every day in the news, there's something new about sports law and ethics. It seems like there's a challenge every day that comes up. Labor management issues, doping. To just stay current, I think, is the greatest challenge that a professional or a legal professional faces. And I mean, the next issues, in my class, I always say, like, the NFL is the gift that keeps on giving for sports and law issues. It seems like every week there's something to be addressed. So I think that it's tough to forecast what's ahead, but I do feel like labor management issues are going to be a big issue, and in the ethics part of it, what's right conduct and right behavior by the players, and of course as it impacts on the brand and the sport and the team itself.
Bob, what are some of the emerging research questions in the field of bioethics? What will we, as an audience, look forward to hearing about with respect to advances in medical and bioethical research in the future? You can predict it here today for us.
Right.
You heard it from Bob Klitzman.
Well, genetics, I would predict that in 10 years or so, when you go to your doctor, your whole genome may be there, and the doctor will say, do you want to know if you have the gene for this sport? I'll press, or I'll press that button. If you want to know if you have the genes associated with that sport, I'll press this button. Do you want to know if you have the gene associated with Alzheimer's or breast cancer? I can press this button or that button.
Lawyer.
What's that?
Lawyer.
Lawyer? Not yet. There's not yet a lawyer, Gene, but hey, talk to me afterwards. But that raises all sorts of issues of where's this information going to be stored. There are apps now where you can download your information and health information. The owner of the app then keeps that information also. There is still genetic discrimination that goes on. Life insurance companies can say, you have these genes, we don't want to give you life insurance, we want to charge you more. And then reproductive issues. So we're at the point now where we can now screen embryos for different diseases. There are companies that say, I'll just give you a boy if you want a boy child, or a girl, or you don't want them to have these genes that you have for diseases, we can get rid of those. But with these new technologies, there's a technology called CRISPR where we can now put genes in and take genes out. And in a few years, probably, this will be available, and people who want to have kids will have these options. And I think that raises a whole set of legal, ethical, social, cultural, financial issues that we all need to become more aware of and be prepared to think about.
Interesting. And Shannon, we've talked a lot today about the ethical curveballs that exist, particularly for athletes, but for many stakeholders in the industry. What advice would you have concluding advice would you have for some of those stakeholders, for the parents, for the coaches, for the agents? What advice would you give to them as an athlete so that they can support those athletes in navigating this treacherous path of ethical conflicts of interest en route to being successful members of society?
I think one thing that really worked for me was communication. Just open lines of communication. You're not always going to get it right, but if you have those open lines of communication and that ability to trust and really bring in informed opinions. And along with that, I would say the more former athletes can get back involved with sports at every level, coaching, mentoring, the front office, sports law, sports management, every area, national governing bodies, international governing bodies, the more former athletes can be involved, they're the ones that have gone through it. They're the ones that have made the mistakes and they recovered from the mistakes oftentimes. They've seen what's going on. They've lived through it. So those young athletes coming up, they kind of identify with, hey, you've been there, done that. I'm not alone in this. So I think as many former athletes that can get back in the game in a different way, that's a good thing.
That's great. Well, this concludes our discussion today. On behalf of the School of Professional Studies at Columbia University, I would like to thank you, Shannon and Carla and Bob, for being guest speakers today for Season 4 of Talks at Columbia. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you. You've raised lots of questions. You've given us lots of insights, and we have a lot to think about in the future ahead with respect to conflicts of interest and ethics in sports. Thank you all very much.